Well, thank you all so much for being present to see my presentation today. I'm so excited to present this material to this conference, to the Confraria do Agro Summit. And I'm really grateful and honored that Gustavo invited me to be a part of this panel. I'm excited to share some of the things that I've seen in Brazil, and I am excited to offer some alternative perspectives from somebody who lives in the United States on some of the future options that you professionals in agriculture have in Brazil. So we're going to talk about all that. I am going to be presenting right now on ESG in agriculture and what that means. And I call it Cultivating Sustainability because the idea here is we're increasing our opportunities to work in sustainability into the future through ESG in agriculture. So let's dive into that. So first of all, here's what I'll be talking about today. And I know I haven't said my name yet because there's a whole slide about who I am. But the first thing we'll address is, well, who is my company? Who is Heartland Cooperative? We're going to talk about that. Then we'll talk about who am I? You guys know my name is Ruth, but what does that mean? Who am I? What do I do? And why am I qualified to talk about ESG in agriculture? Then we'll talk about, well, what is ESG in agriculture? What does that mean? Then we'll talk about environmental sustainability in agriculture specifically, and why we need environmental sustainability in agriculture. I mean, we know kind of why you need it, but really let's dive into that. Then we'll talk about the current trends that we see around the world and how that compares to reality, what we should really probably be focusing on. And then my favorite part, we'll talk about where Brazil shines. Brazil has a lot of opportunity in ESG in agriculture. And so we're going to talk about that. And I will make some suggested career fields for you in the audience who are interested in getting involved in ESG in agriculture. I'm going to give you a few ideas that you can go after for potential careers. And we'll tie it up with some conclusions that I have. Now, I won't be able to be present for you to ask questions after this presentation, but my email address will be at the end, and I invite anybody who has questions to send me an email. I'm very happy to answer emails from my Brazilian friends in agriculture. So first of all, who is my company? Who is Heartland Cooperative? I work for Heartland Cooperative, but what do they do? Well, they are very similar to the agricultural cooperatives that you have in Brazil in like Paraná. So it's a cooperative, meaning that a lot of farmers come together, and those farmers pool their money, they pool their resources, and they purchase inputs like fertilizer and seed and chemical spray. They also can sell their grain, they can sell their corn or their soybeans through my company, and my company helps them with all kinds of infrastructure, equipment needs. We can do custom application. Everything involved in managing a corn and soybean farm, my company can help a farmer with, and we are cooperatively owned by our farmers. And you can see that map of the United States on the slide there. My company is located in Iowa and into Texas. And so we have about 80 locations. We have about 600 full-time employees and another 600 part-time employees. So we're a mid-sized company in the United States. So now who am I? Now, you know my name is Ruth. Okay, my name is Ruth McCabe. But who am I and what do I do? Well, I'm a conservation agronomist. So I'm an agronomist. I work with farmers to produce crops, but I am also focused on conservation. So this picture here is me and my team. That little tiny group of people in the middle, that's my team. And we are surveying a buffer next to a stream. So I help farmers put in things like buffers next to their streams to capture soil before it goes into those streams, right? So I'm helping to protect the environment. And really what I do in a nutshell is I help farmers reduce or prevent the loss of their topsoil and the loss of their nutrients from their fields. So all of these pictures you see on this slide, these are all considered, we call them conservation practices in English, that's what we say. But these are all conservation practices that a farmer can do to reduce the loss of their topsoil or to reduce the loss of the nutrients, the fertilizers, the chemicals that they're putting in their fields. And I underlined topsoil for a reason. Topsoil is underlined in red for a reason. And that's because topsoil is so important to environmental sustainability on farms. The idea here is that if you don't have topsoil, you're not growing food. You're not supporting livestock. We need our topsoil, and it's this very thin layer on top of the earth underneath the plants and the trees and the grass. And that topsoil is actually very thin, and if we lose it, it's very difficult to get it back. So that's what I do for my job. Now, the other thing that I do for my job, because I wear another hat, so I'm a conservation agronomist, but I'm also a Nuffield International Farming Scholar. And what that means is that I travel to other countries and I study farming in other countries. And specifically, I'm studying conservation and environmental farming in other countries. So here are some pictures of some of the countries I've been to in the last 2 years: England, Canada, Singapore, Borneo, Denmark, Australia, and Brazil. So I've been to Brazil and I've studied conservation farming adoption in Brazil. And I'll tell you, it was really cool. So here is where I went when I was in Brazil. I was in Brazil for 4 weeks. Everywhere that you see a little red star is a place that I visited. I went to 26 farms. I saw 8 state or federal agricultural officials. I went to 8 nonprofit agricultural organizations. I saw 7 federal research farms and 5 agricultural retail businesses like cooperatives. I saw 5 of those. And my goal when I was in Brazil was to get a better understanding of how farmers are using conservation farming practices in Brazil. So I wanted to understand a lot better how Brazilian farmers are using regenerative or conservation farming. Okay, so this brings us to our topic, right? This is what we wanted to talk about today, ESG in agriculture. And so ESG stands for environment, social, and governance, right? That's what those 3 letters stand for. And that represents how a company is managing their business plan in a way that is sustainable. But what does that mean in agriculture specifically? So I have these 3 quotes about what ESG in agriculture means, and I'll read them so that the translation software can translate this for you. But ESG is a set of criteria that companies can use to ensure that they are operating in a responsible and sustainable manner. ESG is a framework used to assess an organization's business practices and performance on various sustainability and ethical issues. And ESG reporting helps food and agriculture businesses monitor their progress and communicate that progress to their consumers and their investors and business partners. And it shows that a business is serious about sustainability. So that all sounds very fancy, right? Those are some really nice quotes about what ESG is in agriculture. But what does it look like? So here we have a slide that has some pictures on it that shows why ESG is so important in agriculture. You have a man there sitting in a wheelchair, and he is at a food pantry. That's what we call a place somebody goes to when they can't afford to buy food. They go to a food pantry or a food bank so that they can get food. That's very important, right, to the social component of ESG. And then we have that picture of those solar panels over a good farm field, or those eroded gullies. You've got a picture of some eroded gullies there, or the picture of the soil erosion on the corn plants in the corner there, right? So those are all examples of environmental sustainability. You've got that picture in the lower corner of all the farm workers. That's more governance and social, right? Part of the ESG. And then in the background of this slide, you can see a sprayer that's tipped over and has spilled its chemicals everywhere. That's another example of environmental. These are pictures of why ESG is so important in agriculture. These are all things that an agricultural business has to think about. So here on this slide, I'm showing you that my job is really just focused on the E of the ESG. I am specifically focused on environmental issues in the ESG framework. And even more specifically, as I already said, I'm very interested in preventing erosion because from my perspective, if you don't have topsoil, all the other things that impact ESG don't matter, because if you don't have soil to farm, you're not farming. So that to me is the most important part of the E in ESG. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I care a lot about preventing erosion. And so when you're talking about environmental sustainability, a lot of it does come down to erosion, but other things too, like wildlife habitat and, controlling chemicals and making sure you're not polluting. But really, environmental sustainability is just farming in a way that reduces that loss of topsoil or nutrients and also supports biodiversity and also supports grain production. Because at the end of the day, a sustainable farm is a farm that can produce grains, but that is also environmentally sustainable. I don't think we should turn everything back into a forest, and I don't think we should turn everything into row crop acres. We need to have something in the middle because that's going to be sustainable. So environmental sustainability in agriculture is farming in a way that incorporates some level of sustainability, but still focuses on producing quality grains. And you can have both, but you have to do some work to get both. So here's an example of why we need environmental sustainability, specifically soil sustainability, preserving our soil in agriculture. Here are two pictures of two countries, right? You can see which one is America and which one is Brazil. Now, I took these pictures. These pictures are both of fields right after a big rainfall. Okay, so there was a big rainstorm. You can see in both of these fields, there's some soil erosion, right? There's some erosion going on here, and that's not good. Now, I will say in the United States, we don't use a lot of no-till, and we don't use a lot of cover crops. Only 21% of our land in the United States is in no-till, and only 5% uses cover crops. Now, in Brazil, you're using a lot more no-till and a lot more cover crops. It's about 60% of farmed acres in Brazil are using cover crops and no-till, continuously throughout the year. And that's really good. But even with that, you can still have erosion, as you can see from this picture. But what happens when you get soil loss like this? Because I've talked to farmers who say, well, that's just once, that's just twice. Maybe it's a few times a year. It doesn't always look like that. Here's the problem. That ends up becoming these brown rivers, right? So I took these pictures. That picture from the United States, that river is the Mississippi River, and you can see that that river is brown. That's not a natural color for a river to be. And I took that picture there. You Brazilians should recognize that picture. That's Iguaçu Falls. And you can see that the water there is brown. I took that picture in March, late March. And it was at the time of the year when the first harvest was coming out and people were planting the second crop. That's when your soil is most vulnerable. So when you get a lot of fields that look like those pictures at the top, you wind up with rivers that look like these pictures. And what does that mean from an environmental perspective? Then you get this, right? So now those rivers flow down to the estuaries, the gulfs, and they go into the ocean. You can see on the United States pictures there that all of our soil ends up going into the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see it in that picture. You can see those brown swirls into the ocean. That's soil. That's our topsoil. And for Brazil, your soils predominantly go into the Paraná, which is going through Iguaçu and then down to the Rio de la Plata estuary next to Uruguay and Argentina. And so again, that's your soil, that brown stuff there going into the ocean. That's your topsoil. And so This is why we need environmental sustainability in agriculture, because we want to preserve our soil. We want to keep it in our country so we can keep farming it. We don't want to send it to the ocean. And so this is another example that I tell for people. They see those pictures, and they think, yeah, okay, we have some soil going into the ocean, but is it really that bad? And I show them this because this is really powerful. This is a picture of a truck. This truck is about 10 megatons or megagrams. I'm sorry. This truck holds about 10 to 11 tons or about 10 megagrams of soil. Okay. So if you were at a 60-hectare field, so this is so in the United States, that's about 150, 160 acres. But for you in Brazil, this is a 60-hectare field. That's this truck showing up to that field every year and filling up anywhere from 78 to 300 times and driving away filled with soil. Now, in the United States, our annual topsoil loss is about 13 to 25 megagrams per hectare per year. That's a lot. That's a lot of soil. And in Brazil, yours is a little higher. Yours is 13 to 15. 13 to 50. But that's because in Brazil, you guys have some steeper slopes than we do. In the United States, you guys have to farm bigger hills than we do. So you're losing a little bit more on some of those hills. But at the end of the day, that's a lot of soil coming off of our fields. And guess what, y'all? We're not the only ones. So don't feel like it's just the United States or it's just Brazil that has this problem with erosion. Actually, I took these pictures too. Every country in the world has problems with erosion. We're not the only people who are struggling with this. And so it's just important to realize that everywhere you go, there is this problem. We have on this slide, we have the United Kingdom, we have Britain, we have Canada at the bottom. That's a bunch of soil coming off that field. That's like a big river that's just carrying soil off that field. And then in the other corner, we have Australia. That's a big gully that was formed in the middle of a farm field. So I don't want to sound all negative, right? All doom and gloom, but erosion is a big deal. And it's not just Brazil. It's not just the United States. It's all over the world. So what can we do, right? How can we incorporate sustainability into that to prevent that? If you look at what people are talking about around the world, if you look at current trends, you hear a lot of people talking about carbon programs and biologicals in the soil and soil health and soil insects and microbes. And there's all these programs that are getting designed to help pay farmers for sequestering carbon and for building up their soil microbes and their bacterial health in the soil. But I keep coming back to this. I think the reality is if we don't have topsoil, a carbon program or a biological product or a biological amendment don't mean anything if you don't have topsoil. So I think from an environmental perspective, going into the future for future careers in agriculture, I think it's going to be even more important to preserve our topsoil and to build careers around preserving our topsoil, because that's what is going to keep us sustainable 50 years from now. So this is where I think Brazil shines. So I promised you I would tell you this is why I think Brazil would be so good at this. I saw when I was in Brazil so many farmers who are aware of their erosion. I talked to so many farmers. I went to, 26, 28 farms, okay? And I talked to 3 or 4 farmers on every one of those farms. And everybody said, we know we have erosion and we know we're working to stop it. I heard that so many times. And also, your farming community is so young. You have a lot of very young farmers that are working with their families, with their parents. That is such a strength. And so I saw so much promise in the people who are looking at using new types of cover crops and diversifying their rotations and incorporating buffer strips and filter strips in their farm fields to slow down water in the field as opposed to just at the edge of the field. I saw so much creativity. That's a big promise. The other thing I saw, a lot of agroforestry or integrative livestock forestry and pasture systems along with cropping. So it's got a couple different acronyms. integrated cropping livestock pasture, ICLP, or ILF or ILP, etc. There's all these different acronyms, but this integrated livestock forestry pasture is brilliant. It is brilliant because now you're introducing into an annual cropping system, you're introducing a couple years of perennial grass systems and then a longer term of tree systems. And that perennial system helps hold soil in place longer. And this is a way to still get crops out of these acres every so many years, but also taking advantage of using perennial grass and trees to hold soil in place longer. It brings your overall erosion down to a more sustainable level. This is brilliant. I think integrated livestock pasture forestry systems are really smart. And I saw so many people who were adopting these. So I thought it was brilliant. I also did learn from several farmers about how they're taking their poorer performing acres, their more steep acres where they have more erosion, and they're planting those back to forest. And I think that's brilliant because Brazil has this requirement to put back in some forest on your farm system, and taking your most poor performing acres and putting those back into forest is brilliant also. So I saw so much promise when I was in Brazil. So basically, these are just some of my summaries of where I saw that Brazil could really shine. You have a growing agricultural sector with an increasing awareness of the illegal types of deforestation. And your same young people in agriculture are saying, we know about illegal deforestation. We are following the rules. We're going to do this better, and we're going to be able to prove it. And those same farmers are also aware and they're addressing their environmental problems at the same time, controlling their erosion, for example. I saw a younger agricultural workforce with very strong family business structures. That really impressed me. And then also a competitive agricultural industry. Brazil's ag industry is so competitive and everybody there wants to do better all the time. And I think that's so great. It's great for business. You guys are rapidly adopting precision technology and regenerative practices, and at a rate that we don't have in the United States. I mean, we don't have people who are just getting on top of the technology and the regenerative practices the way you guys do, and that's amazing. So my bottom line is Brazil has the ability to be a conservation powerhouse. I really see that potential for Brazil. So with all that in mind, what are my recommended careers? What do I think you people in the audience who are watching this, what do I think you should do if you want to work in environmental, in conservation agriculture or environmental agriculture? Well, first of all, you could be a conservation agronomist just like me. So there's nothing stopping you from being somebody who works in conservation. And my suggestion here is don't wait for a big farm to come and say, hey, we need a conservation agronomist. If you know how to use conservation practices and you're also an agronomist, start going to farms and tell them, hey, I can do this for you. Give them your resume and say, I can be a conservation agronomist for you. I can help you meet your goals. I can help you reduce your erosion. Go out there and sell that. You could be a forester or a forestry agronomist. So you could be an agronomist that specializes in helping reestablish forest, especially in poor performing acres. So you could say to a big farm, hey, I know you have to put forest in. Let's analyze your yield data. Let's analyze where you have acres that are steep or that are poor performing, and let's put the forest there. The last thing I recommend is being a grain merchandiser that specializes in emissions tracking or emissions tracking data. So you can help a big farm sell their grain. You can help a farm buy and sell their grain, and you can help them track their conservation data, their emissions data. And you can help them prove that they have grain that's low emissions or that is produced on a farm that incorporates conservation or biodiversity or something like that. So you can help those farmers maybe get a premium on their grain because they're using conservation on their farm. These are just 3 suggestions. There's a lot of other things you can do in conservation, but I think these ones would be really good future career fields in conservation in Brazil. So these are just some of my conclusions. We've already talked about all of this, but just you should know in Brazil that every country is struggling with the environmental impact of their agricultural industries. So the United States is struggling. I know I have people say like, oh, America is so advanced. They're doing so much. They're always ahead of the pack. That's not true. We are very advanced, but we're also losing our topsoil too. Every country struggles with losing their topsoil, and this is something we can all come together to work on. But Brazil, you're just like us, and we're just like you. We can all work on this. But Brazil is uniquely positioned, I think, to compete with other countries for sustainability in agriculture precisely because you guys can really reduce your erosion, you can implement reforestation, and you could produce sustainably or low emissions, sustainably grown or low emissions grain. And that's something you could prove in Brazil. You guys have this ability, and I think it would really push you to the front of the pack, right? You also have a lot of young leaders. I loved how many young, motivated people I met in agriculture in Brazil. You have a lot of young leaders who are looking for a specialty in agriculture. And I would recommend that you consider conservation or sustainability because my final point, Brazil really has great potential to be a world leader in conservation farming. So thank you all so much for listening to my presentation. And as I said, my name, again, Ruth McCabe, and my email is right here on the screen. And I welcome anybody to come and reach out to me. You can get my email from the organizers of this conference as well. And you can send me questions. I'd be happy to get those questions and answer those questions for you. So thank you so much for all listening to me. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your conference.
See, I'm back. And can I make you a few questions?
Absolutely, you can. Yeah.
I want to ask you, the first question is kind of a benchmark. So there's something that you saw in Brazil that you thought when you saw like, oh, why you are not using this in the United States? And the reverse question. So what is something that there is in the United States being using and Brazilians are not putting attention on it?
Yep. So Brazil uses a lot of no-till and a lot of cover crops, and we don't really do that in the United States very much. But one thing we do use in the United States in our fields is we use what are called grassed waterways. And those are actually in our fields. We don't put them on the edge of our fields. We put them right through the middle. You know how in a farm field, there's some hills and then some slopes. And when you get to that slope, that's where you sometimes see erosion because it'll form a gully in that sloped area of the field. Well, in America, what we do is we put grass waterways in those spots. So we actually plant grass in a narrow strip in those low spots in our fields, and that grass stays there. It's perennial, and it holds soil in place, and it allows water to move over it so that it's not pulling soil out of the field. Now, we have a lot of those in the United States. I didn't see very many of those in Brazil, actually. And I think that if Brazil started using more of those waterways in their fields, we call them grassed waterways, they would see a lot less erosion in their fields. And I did see some when I was in Brazil. I did see some, but a lot of people aren't using them. So.
What nice answers. We met when you visited Brazil, the last time you visited Brazil, and there's something different that drive the farmers for looking for sustainability like this and preserve topsoil, or is the same feeling in the same reasons for farmers in the United States and farmers in Brazil?
No, I think it's really different. I think what I saw in Brazil were farmers who, when they realized, so all the farmers I met in Brazil, when we started talking about like erosion, and I showed them, like we talked about, well, you're losing your soil, maybe you're losing a millimeter of soil every year, which doesn't seem like much. But when you add that up over 150 years, that's several inches, and now you don't have topsoil anymore. And when I was chatting with farmers in Brazil, over and over again, I heard those farmers say, oh, I have to change that because I want my children and my grandchildren to inherit this soil, and I want them to keep farming here. In the United States, a lot of our farms, there aren't as many kids that want to take over for their parents. So we don't have as many parents that are passing their farms to their children anymore. And a lot of the land that we have in the United States is getting rented. So we have farmers who are renting soil, who are renting those farms. They don't own those farms. And it's just very different here because if you don't own a farm and you don't own that soil, the incentives or the reasons for you to use conservation aren't there. You're not passing that land on to your children. So you're just going to use that farm because you have to make money. And unless somebody is making you use conservation, you might not. But when I was in Brazil, I talked to people who said, oh, I want my grandchildren to farm this land. I have to make sure that I'm saving my soil. So it just was a very different conversation between people in the United States and people in Brazil. And of course, those are generalizations because, of course, I meet with farmers whose their children do want to farm their fields in the United States, right? And I met with farmers in Brazil who they just rent, they don't own those acres. So it exists in both countries, but in Brazil, there was really a drive from farmers who really want to pass their land on to their children. And I think that's going to be a big changer for Brazilians. I think that's what can make sustainability more popular in the future for Brazilians because they want their kids to inherit that land and farm it.
But in both cases, we have a lot of conversations to introduce them the importance of sustainability and conservation. And in your rights was the I don't know, maybe the three most efficient arguments to call them to this kind of battle. It's an important battle.
Yeah. Well, the biggest argument is if we don't have topsoil, we're not going to be farming for much longer. So we have places in the United States that have lost all of their topsoil. And in those fields, they are getting half to 1/3 of the kinds of yields that they could get if they still had topsoil. So when you lose your topsoil, you're still farming soil, you're just farming subsoil. It's the soil that's beneath the topsoil, and it's not very good quality. You will lose over half your yield once you're farming subsoil. So the biggest reason to preserve soil is to keep getting good yields. If you don't have topsoil, you're not going to get good yields. And the second biggest reason is that in reality, if you use conservation practices for long enough, like if you use no-till, if you use cover crops, if you put in grass waterways, if you have buffer strips, if you rotate, if you use things like integrated livestock forestry, etc., long term, those soils are more productive. They're more productive, you get a greater return, you get greater yields. But it takes a while. It takes 10 or 15 years. It takes several years to build up that fertility. So sometimes people try a conservation practice for a couple years, they don't like it, and they quit, and they don't ever see those benefits. You have to stick it out for 10 or 15 years, and that's really tough for people when they want to see a short-term benefit. And I think the third biggest reason why adopting conservation, into a farm management is that it also satisfies that environmental need that is very important. Right now in Brazil, you have some regulation, you have some laws that force farmers to have buffers or that they have to have a certain amount of forestry. We don't have a lot of regulation in the United States for farmers. So in that respect, in Brazil, you're ahead of us than the United States because we don't have as much regulation as you guys do about maintaining forestry. So here I tell farmers, if you want to continue to have the freedom to manage your farms the way you want to manage them, we've got to start now and incorporating environmental practices into our management, because soon there will be laws that make you do it. And then you really won't like it. And then I can say, look at Brazil, they have all these laws. So I say to American farmers, if you don't like regulation, you have to start doing it now, because otherwise in the future, you're going to be forced to do it, and then you really won't like it.
Yes, for sure. Brazil, it's a kind of tradition in Brazil. This, when you have to move forward into a good goal, laws come in first place to drive everybody a little bit mad, a little bit crazy, but a little bit more motivated to do the right thing. Ruth, I'm so glad to see you here in the summit. Thank you for say yes for our invite and to be here with us and the way it was possible. And I hope to see you with us in the next years here materially, presentially.
Yeah.
So see ya. Thank you.
Thank you. Muito obrigada.
De nada.